census and the use of their vulnerability as power. Finally, I bring up the contradictions that the publication of these images of hungry bodies can generate. So on January 20 of this year, the article "We are unable to count the bodies," não estamos conseguindo contar os corpos em português, circulated through various media outlets in Brazil. The headline, which is impactful on its own, was accompanied by photographs that intensified the words. They portrayed the genocide of an indigenous ethnic group in northern Brazil, the Yanomami. Unfortunately, it is common to have articles about the Yanomami denouncing murders caused by conflicts, with gold miners, land invasions, and environmental issues. However, the image of starving bodies added another layer of shock for all Brazil and the world. The consequences of political choices in recent years were materialized in the form of malnourished women, children, and elderly individuals in severe food insecurity situation, disclosed by the indigenous leaders themselves to denounce the violence they were experiencing. Here, it is important to highlight that I consider the condition of hunger based on the work Geography of Hunger by Brazilian sociologist Josué de Castro, asserting that hunger is not only related to lack of food, geographic issues, or natural order, but is essentially political and connected to social inequalities. Therefore, the photographs in this article were sent by indigenous people and the healthcare workers as a form of denunciation, because it was necessary to show for the rest of Brazil what is happening in a territory that undergoes a process of invisibilization most of the time. However, a few days later, another appeal was widely circulated. One of the women portrayed had passed away, and it was requested that her image no longer be shared, because in the Yanomami mourning process, the name of deceased is no longer spoken, their belongings are burned, and the circulation of the photographs is avoided. Therefore, despite the importance of the photographs for denunciation, a cultural image emerged that needed to be respected. The Yanomami territory is one of the largest indigenous demarcations covered by forests in the world, with approximately 665 villages in Brazil and Venezuela. The direct contact of these Brazilian ethnic groups with non-indigenous people is recent and occurred in the mid-20th century, marking the beginning of conflicts and the struggle for rights in the territory. The history of Yanomami resistance has always been turbulent, but it is intensified in the last 4 years of the extreme right government of Bolsonaro, weakening their environmental protection laws. So you can change the slide. Thank you. One of the highlights of the publication of the photographs of the Yanomami suffering from hunger was to denounce the limited datification of what happens in the indigenous territories and to their inhabitants, arguing that the statistical blackout is another form of promoting death. So the very title directs the focus to this issue. We are unable to count the bodies, with the act of counting emphasized in its statement. Can you pass again, please? Thank you. So throughout the article, the only image that does not show malnourished individuals is one of a notebook with a manual count of deaths of members of different ethnic groups. It records 8 deaths of children and elderly that occurred over a period of 10 days when the health team's helicopter was broken. But the official government data only reports 3 child deaths in the territory, erasing the other 5 children and elderly individuals. Although it is an image without dramatic visual elements, it is equally impactful. The handwritten count in a notebook with the manual counting of family members who die from treatable causes turns manual recording into means of denouncing the statistical blackout experiences there. It is possible to understand the struggle for quantification in Yanomami territory through the concept of data colonialism, using it as a tool for critical analysis. Paola Riquarte argues that we live in an epistemological terrain where data processing helps us to understand the contemporary world and produce knowledge. Data are used for politics, health, transportation, and various social layers, with the argument that more data provide a stronger foundation for decision-making. However, she warns that collection and processing of information are financed by knowledge infrastructures developed by states, corporations, and research centers, most of which are in the global north. In other words, the system feeds a coloniality of power, where our data is transformed into knowledge to fuel the concentration of capital and accumulation of large companies and states in the global north, reproducing updated ways of colonialism. In the case of Yanomami, there are two layers of data colonialism that need to be analyzed. The first is the extensive datification of natural resources, presenting the demarcated territories concerning location value and environmental impact of mining to enable the network of illegal activities in the area. According to the investigative report by Repórter Brasil, clandestinely extracted ore from Brazilian indigenous lands can end up in jewelry or electronic components or cell phones, computers, and cameras. And the manufacturers of these products, including major foreign technology companies like Amazon, Google, and Apple, acquire these ores after various stages and may not even know or prefer to ignore their raw origin. On the other hand, while there is a significant production of mining relating to data concentrated in illegal networks, there is a statistical blackout by the Brazilian state. The blackout of illegal mining is directly related to the blackout on data concerning the Yanomami people who inhabit the territory and suffer from constant invasions, blocking from the national indigenous people agents from accessing more isolated communities to provide assistance. This contradiction is an example of how the enabling and invisibility of data can be used in conjunction to fuel new forms of colonialism and establish complete submission of the human life to corporate interests. The main things of colonialism is an arrangement of process. They are part of the dominant epistemology, resulting in the domination of bodies, affections, and territories. However, in the case of Yanomami, not being included in data sets is problematic. Invisibilizing the Yanomami is a necropolitical strategy using the Mbembe concept, considering the violence directed at specific groups in society through negligence in terms of health, safety, and other actions leading to death of precariousness of the lives of certain individuals or communities. Thus, these choices promote illegal mining in the territory and the maintenance of colonial structures. In this case, having a database could be an instrument to compel the government to take action. Since there is no data collection and disclosure, the article and its compelling images become one of the strategies for these people to be seen. Violence that is offline begins to operate online and in a network with the publicizing of photographs of malnourished Yanomami individuals. Can you pass for me, please? On the other hand, the dissemination of these photographs on digital platforms can also be seen as an attempt to create compassion and visibility. They want to be seen, they want their issues to be identified, made visible as a form of dissensus, and what Jacques Rancière terms in distribution of the sensible. In other words, the photographs seek to inform a situation that is happening, but is not present in the social imaginary and undergo a process of invisibility. With the publicizing of these images, and the appropriation of digital communication, they become part of the social imaginary, create a new aesthetic reference, and engage in politics through the shocking images of their bodies. So this appropriation of digital communication made by the Yanomami is understood from a perspective of potency, following the definitions of Maria Isabel Neumann. So the author understands appropriation with a collective and resistance character, through which subaltern groups produce new meanings, uses, and goals in response to the definitions of the world imposed by cultural, economic, and institutional offerings of the system. It is important to highlight the autonomy of action in the act of appropriation. It is not prior session, but is intentional act by the record's subjectivity based on alterity. In this case, the Yanomami appropriation of digital platforms to denounce genocide and statistical blackout in the territory cannot be seen in any way as a session. Instead, it is an intentional act that demonstrates the agency of the ethnic groups present in the report and their use of journalist portals for denunciation. Therefore, to understand the process of appropriation, it is necessary to highlight their double meaning, a capitalism appropriation and resistance. According to Graciela Natashason, appropriation is movement, tension, thesis, and antithesis, a dialectical movement of both the external world and human thought. So by appropriating digital platforms and sharing photographs of members of ethnic groups in a state of severe food insecurity, Yanomami leaders are repositioning their existence in everyday society and disnaturalizing the meanings of their own bodies to destabilize normative standards and attempt to transform social order. However, when sharing images of these suffering bodies, it is important to understand the exposure of vulnerability not as a place of powerlessness, but as a practice of political resistance. So Judith Butler understands vulnerability as a fundamental aspect of the embodied human condition. She views vulnerability as an ontological and ethical state inherent in our existence, connecting us to the others. She also emphasizes that despite explicit violence against their bodies, these political subjects are not passive or incapable. And exposing vulnerability as a denunciation can also be a form of agency. The circulation of images of these malnourished bodies has disrupted aesthetic norms and normativity related to those bodies. So Susan Sontag, in her essay regarding the pain of others, analyzed the representation of pain, suffering, and violence in photography, using images as a means to bring the viewer closer and make real or more real matters that socially privileged people or those simply safe might prefer to ignore. However, these images also bring contradictions, and they can generate a sense of shock at the moment of first viewing the photo. So she questions whether this shock has an expiration date. As much as the images bring us closer to the issue, increase awareness of suffering, and invoke solidarity, they can also immediately produce indifference, distance, and sense of emotional anesthesia, because certain horrors simply happen in that place. And there is a sense of that nothing can change the situation. Can you pass for me, please? Thank you. 3 days after the publication of the article about Yanomami genocide, an elderly woman who was in severe state of malnutrition passed away. So immediately, Yanomami leaders, such as Junior Yanomami, asked that the images cease to be shared in news and digital platforms to respect the mourning process from their culture. So the Yanomami requests not to share the photo is in line with the need to control their own image and narrative, reaffirming their agency and decision-making power. By making this appeal, they are exercising the right to preserve their culture and avoid exposing their vulnerability in a way that does not involve their decision-making. Moreover, the very act of widely disseminating this request to remove the image by journalism portals reinforce this agency. However, once an image is shared on social media, there is no total control over it. And as Susan Sontag asserts, photographs objectify, turn a thing or a person into something that can be possessed. Their sharing loses control. It seems to become infinity. So in this context, I conclude my presentation with some questions. Can you pass for me, please? It is really possible to keep the elderly woman's photograph offline, or it is possible to the Yanomami to have the choice to stay offline. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. If we have some questions, we are going to wait until the end, if you agree. And we are going to continue with the next panelist. The next speaker is Ana Vallarta. She holds a bachelor degree from UNAM in Latin American Studies and a master's degree from Tübingen University in Cultures of the Global South. She's currently doing her PhD at Tübingen University about figurations of slow violence in Latin American recent narrative. Her areas of interest focus on literary representations of violence and recent women literature. The presentation experience of crisis in the Bildungsraum of the Global South stems from her master's thesis titled Crisis of Language and Narrative of Displacement in 3 selected novels of the Global South. So welcome, Ana, and please, when you want, you can start.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Gabriela, also for your presentation. Although I'm going to be talking about something rather different, I do think there are a lot of connections with what you just presented. So maybe we can go through that at the discussion in the end. Can you help me sharing my presentation, please? Yeah, okay. So in this presentation, I will be talking about experiences of crisis in Bildungsromane from the Global South, also known as coming-of-age novels, which, in a few words, is a genre that focuses on narrating the psychological and moral growth of the main character as they transition from childhood to adulthood. So in the Global South, especially in recent times, although some of the genre's traditions have been challenged, the Bildungsroman has proven to be useful in narrating the female subjectivity, as it depicts the tensions between individual experience and the sociopolitical context marked by the crisis, and particularly the tensions encountered while growing up within post-colonial gender and racial structures. However, unlike the traditional Bildungsroman, many of these novels dispense with the needs of granting meaning to the experience of violence and loss resulting from recent sociopolitical crises, by framing them under the notion of rites of passage. Instead, they make visible the experience of crisis in the Global South as lived and narrated by marginalized girls. In this sense, my objective is to discuss how strategies from the Bildungsroman are mobilized in order to propose a form of intelligibility which does not seek to restore meaning, but rather to reveal the crisis of meaning that originates from growing up in a context of acute political crisis. Can you go to the next one, please, Luis? Yeah. So I will focus on recent coming-of-age novels from 3 different corners of the Global South, namely El Verbo J from the Salvadorian writer Claudia Hernandez, Mutisme, written by Titawa Peu, who comes from French Polynesia, and We Need New Names by the author from Zimbabwe, No Violet Bulawayo. So these novels present stories of girls growing up in 3 different socio-historical contexts. It is necessary to keep in mind that there are important cultural and political differences between the 80s in French Polynesia, the 2000s in Zimbabwe, and the 80s in El Salvador. And these particularities configure not only each story in terms of plot, but even in the way that they are narrated at the linguistic, aesthetic, and ethical levels. However, these novels can be brought together here because these countries were affected by acute political and economical crisis in the recent past, which provoked, among other things, displacement and mass migrations. So one key aspect that these novels have in common is that they narrate the stories of 3 girls that grew up in context of crisis, and therefore address the experience of protagonists that negotiate their subjectivity under tense sociopolitical circumstances that expose them from a young age to violence, precarity, trauma, and ultimately to displacement. In all 3 cases, the girls come from communities where people are forced to migrate to seek security and better living conditions within their own country and internationally, with the protagonist eventually migrating to the global north. However, in this space, which in a way had become a false utopia, new forms of exclusion and marginalization take place. Okay, so the first 2 questions that I want to address are, what does it mean to grow up in a context of crisis, and how this experience are narrated in fiction in these novels? So first, I'm gonna, let's have a quick glimpse on the plot of the novels. Luis, can you go to the next one? Yeah. All right, so real quick, Mutisme takes place in French Polynesia between the end of the 70s and the 90s, where the narrator and protagonist, a young girl from Maori origins, has to deal with patriarchal violence, racism, and colonialism from an early age. The novel follows the protagonist's development and political awakeness that results from witnessing the socioeconomic inequalities between the local population treated as otherness within their territories and Europeans who somehow benefit from a supposed paradise. Her discomfort culminates with her indirect participation once she's a teenager in the anti-colonial and anti-nuclear movement that took place in Tahiti during the 90s, mobilized against the nuclear essays that France conducted in French Polynesia, in spite of the opposition of the local population. The protesters were brutally repressed and further criminalized, which results in the protagonist deciding to leave the island. Next one. We Need New Names. So while denouncing the post-colonial politics in Zimbabwe during Mugabe's 30 years presidency, narrates the experience of growing up under a political crisis that caused acute levels of displacement and migration. The protagonist is an 8-year-old girl called Darling, is one of the victims of a campaign to forcibly clear slums that the government carried out in 2005, and in which more than 500,000 people lost their livelihoods or their homes. So the author, through fiction, explores what happened to the children that were affected by such an event, especially those that, like in the case of the protagonist, ended up living first in informal settlements and later migrating outside the country. Next one, please. Finally, in El Verbo Jota, situated in the period from the late 70s to the end of the 90s during Salvadorian civil war, follows a protagonist that is assigned at birth a gender that she does not identify with, and grows up enduring rejection and violence from her father and community because she, who is however read as male, is considered as effeminate. This eventually becomes central to her decision of leaving her country and later her community and later her country. On her journey through Mexico towards the US, she undergoes a series of struggles, often linked with her gender identity. And once in the US, she comes out as trans, which supposes at the same time a liberation as well as new forms of exclusion. So next one, please. Yeah, going back to the questions, what does it mean to grow up in context of crisis and how these experiences are narrated through fiction in the novel? Yeah, I will focus on the implications of formulating these stories with a narrative that follows the coming of age of a girl protagonist confronted with a political crisis. although it could be debated whether the label of Bildungsroman can unproblematically be applied to these novels. Rather than discussing if they are or they are not Bildungsromane, I will focus on how framing the novels as such is useful for analyzing their proposals and understanding narrative choices. So, next one. Yeah, so these stories pose a question, as I mentioned before, of what it means to grow up under conditions of induced precarity by a political system in crisis, and how the experience of loss and displacement can be integrated into the character's subjectivity. The question then is, what does it mean to grow up under the threat of violence, under the dissolution of communities due to economic crisis, and ultimately within a system that perpetuates vulnerable and precarious homes, and therefore impose mobilities? What does literature, and in this case fiction, do with it? Yeah. So this, sorry, yeah, the previous one still. This narrative denounced political systems that make girls and women especially prone to precarity and vulnerability, and even more so when gender intersects with race, poverty, and migration. In this regard, vulnerability should not be understood as an induced, should be understood as an induced political condition which marks both individuals and communities. However, it is often vulnerability that also mobilizes resistance. Yeah, so going back to Judith Butler, vulnerability, precarity, and resistance are intrinsically linked and give rise to each other, with vulnerability to a precarious life often leading to resistance, as well as resistance against precarity inducing a state of vulnerability. So by focusing on the resistance built and the coping mechanism created by the protagonist in the midst of the crisis, the authors reject victimizing narratives and instead present characters that are strong regardless or because of their vulnerability. Moreover, these novels propose epistemological frames that recognize and valorize the process of resistance against the precarization of life, especially by women and girls. And about migration and displacement, these are central in the novel, since the experience of losing or leaving home shape the protagonist's subjectivity to the point that they constantly question the possibility or impossibility of belonging, a Salvadorian or Zimbabwean migrant in the US, or even in the case of the Maoris in their own colonized territory. For Erika Hoagland, I quote, "Many post-colonial Bildungsroman protagonists are perhaps fated never to stop searching, to never stop wondering who they are and where they belong," end of quote. The impossibilities of belonging are exacerbated when the protagonist, as a result of migration, struggles to feel at home both in their country of origin and in the host country, in a way seen as foreigners in both places. So at this stage, I want to turn the focus on the question and ask instead. Can you go to the next one, Luis? Yeah. Why narrate the political crisis from the experience of girls growing up within it? So, yeah, in the Bildungsroman from the Global South, the conventions of the genre are often desestabilized to better account for the female experience, offering the opportunity to question and denounce the colonial and gender structures that perpetuate oppression. Quoting Maria Elena Lima, tracing resistance to such construction becomes central to a post-colonial feminist reconceptualization of Bildungsroman. End of quote. Moreover, she points out that it is a genre particularly suited for women, for women's quest for self-knowledge in its representation of subjectivity in process. Indeed, these three authors have found a way of imagining stories that deal with the complexities found in these regions of the Global South through this genre, including the tensions and contradictions that are encountered in the quest of identity that accompanies the process of growing up of these girls. However, I find a certain paradox in narrating the crisis through the perspective of someone that is growing up within it. That is because the temporality of political crisis, which mainly focuses on the immediate present, clashes with that of the individual temporality of growing up. In other words, during the crisis, there is little possibility of projecting into the future, of imagining the future under circumstances of destruction and dispossession. Therefore, projections of the future are replaced by an unsustainable present that is exhausted in an attempt to meet immediate needs. So, the condensation of the present is in constant tension with the idea of childhood as a projection toward the future. and more precisely with the narrative of growing up in its structure, the narrative of growing up and its structure of progression. So from this perspective, there is a sort of paradox in using the narrative of Bildungsroman to narrate the crisis. However, I am convinced that the strength of these novels lies in this paradox. These stories are denouncing a political system that does not allow children, and especially girls in these cases, to grow up free of the violence and precarity exacerbated by the crisis. Moreover, they narrate through the perspective of girls that were affected by the crisis, seeking perhaps recognition of this experience and losses. In this regard, Lima notes, I'm going to quote, it is significant that many of the post-colonial novels begin with a death rather than with a more conventional birth of the Bildungsroman protagonist, end of quote. This cannot be understood just in symbolic terms, neither as part of a rite of passage, but it's rather condemning the structural violence and precarity that affects subjects of many countries of the global south, often from very young age. I argue that the death of in this case can be even understood in a broader sense as a loss. All three novels begin with a loss that is at the core of the subsequent displacement. In the case of Mutisme, the mom runs away with the daughters fleeing the father's domestic violence. In We Need New Names, the first event is a violent house eviction in which Darling loses her home. And in El Verbo Jota, in spite of having a very classic beginning with the birth of the protagonist, at the same time they are born, the failed gender assignment marks their vulnerability and later impossibility of belonging. So these losses cannot be taken as something merely symbolic, as a milestone that organizes the coming-of-age narrative. These and other challenges that the protagonists face due to political context in crisis cannot be read as simple rite of passages that provide a valuable lesson that shapes the character's moral growth. So in a way, there is a tension. Within the novel, the losses, the displacement, the violence work to some extent as events that organize the process of growing up, as some sort of difficulties that the girls overcome. Yet, to take them just as that would deprive them of their political dimensions. These events are not narrated in the novel in order to develop the character, but rather to condemn the precarity and vulnerability of these girls. I argue that to understand this within the notion of rite of passage would not only depoliticize and dismiss what the novels are denouncing, but even risk attributing meaning to an experience that in fact is inscribed as leading to a crisis of meaning. In this sense, in these coming-of-age stories, the authors reconcile two interests. They propose a story that narrates the crisis with a focus on the experience of marginalized and precarized characters who, as a result of these violent experiences, are confronted with a crisis of meaning. At the same time, they offer a story that uses narrative strategies from the Bildungsroman in order to propose a form of intelligibility. Nevertheless, this form of intelligibility does not seek to restore meaning to the experiences of loss, but rather to reveal the crisis of meaning that originates from a political system in crisis. Okay, so to conclude, the novels that I have mentioned here constitute examples of narratives from the global south that narrate coming-of-age stories in the context of crisis. They propose stories that visibilize and recognize the experience of the subjects during the crisis, but dispense with the need of granting meaning to the violence and loss. In this sense, they take strategies from the Bildungsroman with the aim of proposing a form of intelligibility at the same time as they distance themselves from this classic Bildungsroman. Since, the experiences and challenges that the protagonists undergo are not there to provide a moral growth. Instead, they are denouncing how the crisis and its effects shape experiences of coming of age and confront subjects to the impossibility of justifying the violence, the crisis, to the point that, a crisis of meaning results from this political crisis. This is because the violence and the devastation cancels the possibility of meaning, and literature, conscious of this, does not seek to grant meaning to the experiences under the form of some sort of ordeal that the characters need to overcome. So these coming-of-age narratives then open up possibilities of approaching and rethinking global fictions that imagine ways of existence and resistance in a world too often in crisis. Thank you very much.